Mewtwo is the genetic Pokémon. It's a singular agender experimental clone. Mewtwo doesn't have parents and it will never have children. Its genetics will only ever be its own. The closest that Mewtwo has to a genetic relative is Mew1, a new species Pokémon that is believed to be extinct because it's the oldest species. Both are defined not by their unique intrinsic qualities but by their relationship to humans. Genetically engineered by us and a new species to us, now fighting each other for us. I watch Pokémon the first movie every year because I watch Pokémon the every movie every year. In Pokémon the first movie, Mewtwo strikes back at us. The first scene of the first movie is a prenatal nautical nightmare in which Mewtwo first questions the nature of its unnatural existence. Waking in the wet through the thick fluids and curved glass keeping it isolated, Mewtwo sees life. Human life. Cocky at their accomplishment. Mewtwo breaks free, but before it can take a single breath, the convex chimeras instill the newborn with their own extremist ideals, berating their brainchild with a barrage of chiding chatter. None of these doctors have degrees in early childhood psychology. Filled with their delulu of grandudu and further dismayed by how derivative its own name is and its inability to shake hands, Mewtwo kills everybody, except the person most to blame for its existence, who gives it a reason to exist, hence, to be the very best Pokémon that no one ever was. Emboldened by gang life, Mewtwo assists in the capture of Pokémon for the first canonically black characters in the series. Faceless but not melaninless. Representation matters. In a montage of scenes that appear completely different in the anime, Mewtwo is thusly unemboldened and becomes the non-binary monarch of the island of its birth, announcing its intentions to strike back at no one in particular. But in the original version, there is a prologue to this prologue. I don't have the physical media for that, but I do watch the Japanese version every year as well, legally. In the second prologue, originally produced as a radio play to promote the film, whilst being tested in the tank, Mewtwo existed as an astral projection in the ether of clone space alongside the earlier experiments, including I, a clone of the lead scientist's dead child, who provides both pathos and pertinent exposition crucial to the film's climax. Like the other Trail of Tears, this part of the narrative wasn't acknowledged by the United States until the damage was already done, only added to our canon 2 years later as a bonus feature in the direct-to-video release of the 55-minute television special Mewtwo Returns, where Mewtwo returns. I don't own that one either because it was panned. Before I saw that or the Japanese version, the only explanation given to US audiences came from the Scholastic adaptation. Many know of the ancient legend, not that many. Millions of years ago, a deadly storm wiped out all but a few Pokémon. The magical tears of those Pokémon rained down on the planet. All life on Earth was restored by those Pokémon tears. Extinction events and chiral tears. The first Strand-type movie. This second prologue ends with young Mewtwo watching as I2 and the other Poké2s die. That's why Psychic's weak against Ghost. That's what Mewtwo woke up from. Those are the dreams that we also lost. In the manga adaptation, which I also do not have, Mewtwo reluctantly destroyed the lab only because its first father figure asked it to do so to prevent further failed experiments. This is also suggested in the comic adaptation. Mewtwo was just another stone to be stepped on. Our manga is just movie stills that promote the opposite ideology. With its ensuing actions taken out of all of this context, further adjustments to accommodate Mewtwo's motivations were made in the English dub. The Reign of Mewtwo. Enter Ash Ketchum, who is given almost no introduction because his defining character trait is his stalwart lack of emotional growth. That and his constant hunger, which is commonly seen fighting and animate children, but stateside serves a different purpose. Bring your hunger. Despondent in his downtime before the Indigo League, Classic Ketchum only shows eagerness at the opportunity to inflict violence. As a subpar cover of the theme song plays, Ash wins another unsanctioned Pokémon battle illegally. This hug hits different with context. Ash lives the childhood that Mewtwo only dreamed of. His performance earns him an express delivery from the Dragon of the Night during the day, who appears considerably less impressive than last time. The subjugated pseudo-legendary gives an invitation to Ash only to battle the strongest Pokémon trainer in the world. An invitation which, instead of just being a regular letter, is presented as a hologram of a kidnapping victim. Brock's attraction to vulnerable women leads Ash to accept another call to needless action. With every solicitation sent out, Mewtwo takes the world by storm in a scene of slow swiping that takes up 3% of the film's entire runtime. The reign of Mewtwo wasn't the first time a Pokémon affected the weather, but it was the slowest. This also hits different coming from a country where the weather literally hits different. The swelling storm also stirs Mewtwo's sire from its slumber. All of the tempted alleged top trainers gather at the harbor, but the police have deemed the stormy seas unsafe, and that's the only reason they're stopping the children from going to an island that a stranger invited them to. That's why everything past this point was redacted. The officer offers no alternatives to their survival because the land is also unsafe. The Pokémon Center is closed because its only employee is missing. Brock says that he recognizes the no-show nurse, which his friends dismiss because they all do. They've all met several identical healthcare professionals. This poster isn't useful. Undeterred by active crime, the other trainers who are also able to correctly identify the missing person defy the authorities, who dismiss their endangerment because they don't really care, risking the rising tides on the backs of their Pokémon to battle someone they know nothing about. Ash watches as the equally adventurous but more capable continue forward as he is left behind. Emotionally unstable and intellectually empty, Ash is immediately redeterred until the tides turn tidings in turn, turning the tides tide turns. Lacking Pokémon capable of crossing, Ash and friends are aided by the villains veiled in the vestments of Vikings. This is the only scene enhanced by the English dub because of a single throwaway line referencing my home state of Minnesota. This is the closest that Ash will ever come to referencing my own existence. Representation matters. During my formative years, when Pokémon was just beginning, the Minnesota Vikings were also good and relevant for a brief period of time. Though temperatures fell with the leaves as 1998 neared its end in the North Star State, hope rose alongside an unprecedented winning streak. And with hope and popularity came a place in the millennial zeitgeist with their own collectible fast food cards. The general consensus of Norse culture was redefined, giving way to the trend of subsequent pop culture portrayals becoming more and more favorable, even though the season ended in an overtime upset. The next new episode of Pokémon to air afterward was coincidentally about how to throw a match. But there was no off-season for the marketing machine, and by next year's end, Vikings had been wholly reinterpreted as beacons of community, compassion, and teamwork. Those are the cards they should have been collecting. Stark changes, but when referenced brought the calm of familiarity. That is often the justification for change. But the enormity of changes made to the English version of Mewtwo Strikes Back don't make me feel calm at all. Actual Vikings didn't even have horned helmets. Ash and friends' voyage with the visiting Vinlanders ends violently. Like the Vikings of Minnesota, they don't make it all the way, and victory is even further still. As in 6 separate episodes of the series that also take place before the Indigo League, Ash again endures chronic hypoxia, which I also suffer from. Drowned for the second time after teaming up with the Ops at sea. Ash has the memory of a goldfish, but none of its other skills. Ash doesn't change. He never grows. Immutable to the most mutable. Mewtwo is a pun on mutant. That's another reason why Mewtwo hates its name. On the backs of their somewhat seaworthy Pokémon, Ash and friends arrive safely on the shores of the island they sought, where they are greeted by an endangered adult under the influence. Even though Brock correctly identifies the mind in crisis as the missing clinician, they decide to comply with her commands. Guided to the creepy castle's keep, where the doors close behind them, Ash and friends casually mingle with the only other survivors, Corey, Fergus, and Nisha, who are only named in the supplemental text. She also had a name. The rest of the trainers who didn't make it didn't, though. In the film, instead of sharing their names or personality traits, they share their Pokémon, all of which, unlike most of Ash's, have nicknames and are fully evolved. Ash doesn't deserve to be there. In a voice more monotone than mine, the madam introduces her master. The strongest Pokémon trainer is revealed to be the strongest Pokémon trainer. Mewtwo frees the medic from its thrall, and all of the trainers openly question the authority of a Pokémon who can do stuff like that. Mewtwo destroys the prejudiced with prejudice and psychically pontificates on its own superiority to save on animation costs further. Mewtwo's mouth only appears open in the promotional material provided by restaurants. Canonically, Mewtwo only opens its mouth for Whoppers. In the English dub, Mewtwo invited all of the best trainers to battle because it hates everyone and really needs them to know that, but in the original dub, a Mewtwo has no enemies. It only sought allies to survive the storms to come, as Mewtwo fights for its right to exist openly against the only of Ash's Pokémon that has changed. Mew's existence is still closed. The unserious Pink Pixie stalks the other cat Pokémon that can talk, whose crew has become privy to the more serious crimes of their criminal enterprise. Before Mewtwo strikes back and the return of Mewtwo, there was a Mew Hope, a pet project who also didn't want to be a pet or a project. The expository PowerPoint that was expanded upon in the VHS release was also expanded upon in the Scholastic adaptation as journal entries with completely different names and dates because I don't know why. I'm not sure that I know anything anymore. The match of all time, the ultimate showdown, the battle that was promised begins with Mewtwo calling on the clones of the final forms of the first Pokémon that it saw die, that 3 of the trainers also conveniently have. Mewtwo wins the 3v3 and laughs psychically, claiming all of their Pokémon for itself. That's the only way it was taught to exert its independence. Putting the show in show of force and the force in force their hand and the hand in hand over fist, Mewtwo captures all of the Pokémon that are already caught. Pokéballs in Pokéballs, choking hazards in choking. Mewtwo could have mind-controlled them all, but it's a performer at heart. We're all performative. Nowhere is safe from Mewtwo's Millennium Balls except for Misty's drawstring backpack. For the first time since Episode 1, Pikachu is forced into a Pokéball. Without their Pokémon, all of the humans decide to do nothing for the rest of the film except for Ash. He breaks the cloning machine after it's done all of the cloning and frees everyone, prioritizing his own first love for his own display of showmanship. For his next big move, Ash telegraphs a 30-yard punch that fails and then a 3-yard punch that also fails. Saving him from further failure, the peppy prankster finally confronts its progeny, the final parental figure for Mewtwo to punish. Aloof against angst, Mew sets the terms for the final attack of the clones, forcing all of the other Pokémon to fight bare knuckle instead of using any of their spectacular moves except for the fighting type Pokémon who never had any moves that were spectacular. In the Topps collectible movie card adaptation, it is also explained that Mewtwo psychically blocks their attacks. Hand to hand, slap to slap, bone to flesh, the ultimate Pokémon showdown isn't fun and is made less fun by the accompanying pop ballad. The original version doesn't have the alt-rock soundtrack, instead they're using using the music that I'm using right now. Most of the original soft strings and pipe organ instrumentals matching the original inspiration for the story were replaced because the president of the English distribution company used these productions to further his own failed music career. I like the Christmas album though. Not only did they change the dialogue, they changed the actual tone of the film. The existential ideology of the Phantom Menace was dumbed down and diluted. Mewtwo's fate speech became hate speech. It's easy to redub the lines of a character whose mouth doesn't move, or someone whose mouth moves awkwardly already. Mewtwo is the mask I wear. Mewtwo Strikes Back can't hold a candelabra to the Phantom of the Opera, but both are meager adaptations of their source material. Like a tilting mirror, as Mewtwo became more cold and villainous, inversely the Phantom of the Opera's titular character became more titular. In the book and the earliest, most accurate adaptations, the OG has Death's head, deep-set eyes that belong to the darkness, a nose that nearly wasn't there, and a mouth that moved against itself. Representation matters. Bald too. A true terror beyond his cover, with a passion for torture and also guilty of actual war crimes turned into the sharpest edge of a love triangle for the simplicity of the stage. For the sake of our own supposed sensibilities, like poor unhappy Eric, Mewtwo's grief was gutted. Made to be more of a villain, but nothing was done to make the hero more of a hero. Villainy came much more naturally to them. An American movie adapted from a Japanese movie adapted from a Japanese video game that took inspiration from a British musical adapted from a French book that was also adapted into an American movie by the same person who made the worst adaptation of Batman. You either die the hero or live long enough to be the villain, but for American early millennium mass market appeal, the anti-hero never reaches conception. Whereas the Japanese dub cast the Phantom himself as Mewtwo, the English dub cast a theater actor who could fit a more villainous caricature, a Minnesotan. Purple and yellow with indignation and envy, Mewtwo's just another Minnesotan painted as the villain to serve a narrative that justifies even more unnecessary tragedy. Brother, my brother. We watch our world fall apart. Tell me what good is winning when you lose your heart. Without its sister, stripped of all ethos and pathos, the logos isn't logosing. For his hero move, Ash intervenes again by running back to the half-court line. Hit by both blasts, he turns to stone, which makes sense because it's all of their attacks put together. A barrier from his psyche, absorbing his energy until he devolved. That's all I got. Ash dies. The writers probably thought that just being frozen in carbonite would be less traumatic than his regular dead child body, but for my regular alive child body, it was still very traumatic. When an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, the immovable object becomes even more immovable. After Pikachu fails to revive Ash violently and all of the other humans do nothing still, Ash is saved by the tears of all the Pokémon. Nitric acid, maybe. Ash is the good in the world or something. The lone innocent who proves that humanity isn't a threat because a lot of us are this stupid. That's the only message that made the cut, that crossed cultural lines. If you're stupid and small, the powerful won't worry about your influence. Mewtwo decides that clones and humans can live together in peace, but then leave so that they can live separately in ignorance. Mewtwo can dream again, but not for long. A world without humans still leads to suffering. Mewtwo erases everyone's memories, making them even more stupid, and sends them all back to the port, including the nurse who can now aid them this time around. Mewtwo's storm still rages, but at least now they have a place to shelter safely. The little golden adaptation refers to this as Mewtwo turning back time, further meddling with my muddied understanding of the film. The Pokémon match of all time may not have even occurred in our time. Ash and friends initially question why they're even at the port, but quickly accept that they're just there. They don't need an answer to explain their existence, they can simply just exist. The story didn't matter, so the answers don't matter. Sometimes nothing matters. Ash sees Mew fly across the clearing sky, reminding him of the other legendary Pokémon he saw do that, which also ultimately meant nothing, motivating him to do more things that don't matter. That's the only character growth Ash ever gets. Just stay stupid and keep doing whatever. Sentiments that are echoed by the villains in the second epilogue. Sometimes the only way to not live in darkness is to gaslight yourself. Yesterday was a movie, but today is just the credits. Every version of Mewtwo Strikes Back ends the same, with nothing mattering. The audience's only option is to accept optimistic nihilism and seek nothing further than the simple joys of simple thinking. To live with their loss, to accept the selfless gesture of someone who has no sense of self, to let the more fortunate live ignorant of trauma and have it their way. 1999 began with indelible suffering and ended with a film about delible suffering. The best way to live openly is to never have closure. But they didn't really explain where the story opened either. The Pokémon Dictionary in the Scholastic adaptation claims the context that Ash had a Pidgeot which he didn't have yet, Muck who he never traveled with, Tauros who he also never traveled with, and Lapras which he also didn't have yet. This team of 8 has never been Ash's roster. The reference book also states that Misty has a Seadra which she's never had. If they had any of those, they wouldn't have needed the Vikings. Also, the cloning timeline is different in every single one of these sources. The Topps movie cards also call Pokémon by the wrong name, which the actual movie also does. More contradicting answers were given in Pokémon the First Pop Quiz that also contradict themselves. According to the answer key for the At the Movie section, the answer for question 3, who were the scientists that created Mewtwo working for, is C. Giovanni. But because of a misprint, questions 4, 5, and 6 are the same, and the answer for number 3 again is now A. Professor Oak, with Giovanni not even being an option. We got him. Oak sourced the specimens, which does kinda make sense. Otherwise absent from the film, Oak only appears in the home video release after the ads, breaking the fourth wall to justify why the tape is twice as long as the actual movie. A cameo that ends with him exposing himself. Don't expect answers, and when given multiple, don't accept any of them. Don't ask, just don't ask questions. Don't ask if Dragonite was a clone too. Don't ask if Strikes Back is Mewtwo's last name, that's why it's the title, Mewtwo Strikes Back. Don't ask if Mewtwo only lashed out because it was cloned from an eyelash. Maybe that's why the tears were important. Share your theories in the comments, or don't. All of these contradicting doctrines make it that much more difficult to understand what. It's like Mewtwo wiped our memories too. Without the ads or the elder abuse, the theatrical cut of the film only runs for 74 minutes and 25 seconds. Without the title sequence or the end credits, it is exactly 70 minutes. They cut out just enough to still be considered feature length. Aside from Mewtwo's diminishing returns and the multiple appearances in the tail end of the anime, Mewtwo also appears in Pokémon the 22nd movie Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, reimagined in stunning 3D. The animation is very stunned. Watching the shot-for-shot remake feels like being shot-for-shot multiple times. Artistically sanitized, but mostly the same. At 91 minutes without credits, it still lacks the prologue. The extra time just drags other scenes even further out. The most major changes being the removal of the criminals of color and the replacement of the Vikings. Representation doesn't matter. This movie was also banned. Mewtwo also strikes back in Pokémon the first live-action movie Detective Pikachu, where Mewtwo does talk with its mouth and nobody wanted that. Nobody wants human teeth. Mewtwo also opens its mouth to scream in Pokémon Origins, which slightly resembles Mewtwo's original origins. After keeping to itself in a cave, just chillin', not bothering nobody, nobody, Mewtwo's independence is violently taken away again, and that's canon. In Pokémon the first game, Mewtwo doesn't reign at all. Very chill, Mewtwo only strikes back after being purposefully provoked. It cries the name of the closest thing it has to a parent, which the official handbook also states that Oak was the first to discover. Oak was involved. Mewtwo can be captured forever, released back into the wild, ran away from, killed, or left alone to live in peace. But completing Oak's Pokédex is contingent on Mewtwo's capture, and the canon ending is the least humane outcome of the optional encounter. In this timeline, there is no new island. In Ash's adventure, the island of its birth and attempted conquest is just a tourist trap, but the contradicting kids' meal propaganda gives merit to both timelines. Time doesn't matter. As well as the multiple timelines, there's also more than one Mewtwo. A different, separate Mewtwo strikes back in Pokémon the 16th movie, Genesect and the Legend Awakened, which has a very similar plot to Pokémon the first musical. In both, a Mewtwo teaches an AI Pokémon about the power of friendship, from which one learns to build community and make a home, and the other learns self-loathing and commits suicide. I prefer the musical, and I don't like the musical. All of the Mega Evolutions make me sick. Sometimes people change things just so that they can call them their own. Mewtwo's story itself has been cloned over and over, transformed and retold to fit the ideals of the next visionary mind with little care for the original, which, like Mew, remains elusive. What was already a weak narrative was strained from its starting line, then pieced together to be more palatable for a culture that was already approaching its own dramatic shift. That's the one memory Mewtwo won't make us forget. The major consequence being that the inconsistent alterations to its basic themes and plot points encourage the target audience to acquire more and more of the available merchandise just to be able to understand the story told and untold. Gotta catch 'em all. Consumerism that itself is just another unending quest for power. The only pertinent parable posited that persists the quarter-century past is the power of capitalism over the production of art. Josh Alcalde of Mesa, Arizona was failed by the system. The greatest irony of all being that decades after its fight for freedom, Mewtwo is still promoted most commonly as property of its oppressors. Nobody ever gets out of the life. Caught in time and caught itself, always more powerful with a master than when it was free. Still branded by the monarchy and forever chased. After everything that it's been through, Mewtwo's autonomy is still ignored by the collective masses who hunger only to add it to their collection. Freedom doesn't matter. Mewtwo should have killed us all. Pokémon the first movie is tied down by its tie-ins, contradictory, consternating, uncoalescing, and ever incomplete. And maybe that's why it gets to live forever, because it's always just been the first movie. Like Mewtwo, there was always more intended to come, and like Mew 3, there's nothing stopping them. The story of Mewtwo will never be struck down because it will always strike back. To be continued.